Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It looks like we have a very big crowd this afternoon, so we're excited to go ahead and get started. And we have a big cast of characters as well on our side. Just a couple of quick notes. Please remember to turn off your cell phones and close your email and other programs on your computer just to make sure that there's no issues with that. In addition to myself, we have Mary Palman and Jennifer Alpha from TDA who will be presenting. And then also from HUD, the irrepressible NSP staff, CPD Notice, John Laswick, and Hunter Kurtz. And before we get started, I know there were just a couple of comments and big shout-out thank yous that they wanted to make. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to them just for a minute.
Great. Well, thanks, Dion. And for those of you who don't realize this yet, Dion has become the president of her company, TDA, and I think her new title is Exalted One. I think, isn't that what you told me you wanted? So, but we really appreciate the TDA group. It's been a long process. Mary and Dion have been helpful, and especially Jennifer Alpha deserves a tremendous amount of credit for writing this this guide. We've gone around a number of times. And then we had really valuable help at the end from a number of reviewers who took time out of their days to take a look at this before we finalized it and try to make it more real. And we got some great comments. So I just would like to recognize Shonda Harold in Riverside, California, Kate Kreider in Phoenix, Carol Rourke in DuPage County, Illinois, Michelle Wildman with the state of Michigan, Sally Adams with the state of Georgia, Mitch Glasser from Orange County, Florida, and Jane Seiden from the Community Builders, along with a couple of our escaped NSP specialists in Jacksonville, Lori Serino, and Portland, Oregon, Bree McClain. And last but not least, certainly not least, Hunter Kurtz here, who's carried really most of the weight of this whole process with considerably more patience than I usually have. Anyway, we appreciate it, and we really hope this is going to be a useful document, but as we said in the notice, it's something that we expect to keep changing. So it's, you know, as we discover soft spots or you know, misphrased sentences or whatever, we're always prepared to make it better, and I'm sure we'll continue to do that. So I'll turn it back to Dion.
Well, can I say something real quickly before we move on? Well, thank you, John, for the compliment, but just real quickly wanted to give you all an update of where we stand with the closeout process. We are still waiting for the PRA process to come to an end. That's the Paperwork Reduction Act. That's where we have to publish through the Office of Management and Budget a notice saying that we're not creating too much paperwork. And that notice has been published, and we've fortunately got an emergency notice, so it is only need to be up 14 days rather than the standard 90. We're in the middle of that 14 days right now, so as soon as that we get that back, OMB will send us some stuff, and we have to do a little paperwork to just to certify everything, and we should be ready here within the next couple weeks to actually start for real this time. Well, knock on wood. For real this time to start closing out some grants. So we're close, folks. We're close.
Right.
So I'll turn it back over, I guess, now to Diane. Dion, I'm sorry, Dion.
Exalted One.
Yeah, Exalted. I apologize.
So much easier to pronounce.
On one knee. That's
Great. Well, thank you for that, and I know there have been a lot of thank yous, and there will be a lot more as folks actually do start the closeout process. Just wanted to note that there are some resources out there. Hopefully a lot of you received the 1CPD email blast earlier this afternoon announcing the release of the closeout guide. We'll talk a little bit more about the guide specifically in a moment, but just so you know, it is now up on the 1CPD Resource Exchange and available for you to download and read at your leisure. We have this webinar, and then there is also another webinar that's going to be scheduled for May 1st that will be more specialized. This one is really meant to be sort of general topics, And the one on May 1st will go into some special topics and some specific things that the folks at HUD really want you to be thinking of in terms of post-closeout and planning for what that future is going to look like. The closeout guide was released and posted on 1CPD this afternoon. It's really meant to supplement the notice. Obviously, the notice is the official document, but the guide is really meant to kind of take that and then help you think through how to operationalize the closeout and really work through that process. So it includes a lot of examples, some clarifications in terms of more explanation about what certain things in the notice mean and are intended to mean, and then also some forms where they're actually annotated to sort of talk you through what needs to be provided in each piece. As Hunter and John always like to say, this is a living document, so it will be updated, but this is sort of the first take at it, and it is a first take that took a long time coming and is probably much more thorough and complete than it would have been otherwise. So I think you'll find it, generally speaking, very useful. A couple of things that we want to highlight and that we're really going to talk about today are the closeout criteria. So how do I know when I'm really ready to close out? Right, what's the checklist that I need to walk through? How can I best prepare for that? And those are the elements that we're really going to walk through on the webinar today. It also includes things like the post-closeout requirements, which will be touched upon in the next webinar. Again, provides a whole lot of appendices and resources and references that you may find useful and helpful as you walk through that process. So this afternoon, we really want to cover 4 things. A couple of fast facts, just things to know about how HUD anticipates the closeout process is going to go and what it's going to look like, what the criteria are, so how will you know when you're ready, what you'll need to do to prepare for that, and then towards the end, a conversation about the fact that there will be technical assistance provided to folks as part of the closeout process. So I think the HUD staff have been really thoughtful about making sure that you're not just kind of left out there to figure this out, and they are working right now on making sure that there's a process to make sure that you have the help you need to get all the way through, get the documents complete, and have everything ready for when you actually get it submitted to HUD for final review. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer, and she's going to walk us through the first section.
Thanks, Deanne. Okay, so the fast facts, really, we put these together because we had some pretty common themes in terms of questions that came up both in previous webinars and from our reviewers when they reviewed our draft previously. So this is just sort of hot button issues that people had burning questions about and some confusion about, so we want to clear those up front. So first is, criteria for closeout is not the same as the criteria for meeting expenditure deadlines. You'll remember that for expenditure deadlines, HUD allowed grantees to combine both line of credit and program income that had been extended to reach the amount that was required by the deadlines. For closeout, however, HUD's going to be looking for grantees to exhaust their line of credit funds prior to commencing the process. And we'll talk a little bit throughout the presentation today about what that's going to look like for everybody. But just to know that the requirements for meeting the expenditure deadline is different than what you're going to be seeing in closeout. Also different from expenditure is that there is no deadline for closeout. So for expenditures, you had set deadlines along the way, and while HUD would like those who are close to meeting the closeout criteria to proceed expeditiously through the process, it is understood that it may take a good amount of time for some grantees to fully expend their line of credit and be ready to close out their grant. So not to stress out, there is no deadline, but for those of you that are pretty close, HUD would like to see you moving towards that goal. You will be able to use your program income after closeout. Some folks were wondering what happens to my program income, will it still be there for me? It will. You won't lose it, and in fact, you'll continue to earn program income after closeout, perhaps. Now, the treatment of program income that is earned after closeout is a little bit different than the program income that you earn pre-closeout. And if you look at Figure 6 of the closeout guide, it walks you through how different entities are treated in terms of program income after closeout. And we're not going to really get into that much today. That's probably going to be a topic that we save for the next webinar because it is a little more detailed than some of the overview we wanted to cover today. So life after closeout will be pretty much the same for most grantees as it is prior to closeout. Some folks, I think, are thinking that it's going to be a different world for them after closeout, but for many, it's going to be pretty much the same. You're going to continue to use the funds that you have for NSP eligible uses and to meet national objectives. And you're going to, one of the bigger differences is that you'll switch to less frequent reporting, which I think will be enjoyable for many. But for most, life isn't going to look much different after closeout if you have a good amount of program income on hand that you still need to spend. As Dion mentioned, TA is going to be available for closeout preparation, and it's going to be available throughout the process. You can request it at any time going to One CPD portal. You can also use the Ask a Question if you have just small questions that you need clarified. But one of the big TA opportunities that will be available to grantees is a readiness check, and we'll be talking about that at the end of the presentation. And so we'll move on to the criteria. So there are essentially 4 closeout criteria that you're going to need to meet before you can actually commence the closeout process. You'll need to have all activities funded with even a penny of line of credit funds. You'll need to have them complete, and they will have had to meet a national objective. And we're going to break down each of these criteria as we move through them. This one especially has a lot of components. The second is that grantees have to meet the 25% set-aside requirement. Again, this one has caused a little bit of confusion, so we're actually going to give you an example here and walk through it. We think that might help clear up some of the questions that were raised previously. Grantees also have to, all costs have to be incurred, and other regulatory requirements need to be met. And Mary will walk us through those last 2 points there. So moving on to closeout criteria number 1. So all activities funded with even a penny of line of credit funds are complete and have met a national objective. Let's talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about line of credit funds. These are the funds that are held in the grantee's treasury account. We all know the program income rule that you have to spend your program income before you spend your line of credit funds. And the result of that is that many of you may have a very large amount of line of credit funds remaining, even though you've met your expenditure deadlines because you were spending program income along the way. So you're going to have to work through exhausting those line of credit funds prior to closing out your grant. And specifically, any activity that received even a penny of those funds will need to be complete and meet the national objective. Now, what it means to meet a national objective, which is, we want to remind everybody that physically completing a unit does not mean a national objective has been met. Essentially, you have to have an income-eligible family or household living in that unit. So, for example, under eligible use B, acquisition and rehabilitation, the reconstruction of a home that was demolished is an eligible activity, and it will be physically complete when it's fully constructed and inspected and all costs have been incurred. However, the national objective won't be met until it's rented or sold to a family whose household income is at or below 120% AMI. So don't confuse the idea that you've completed your units with having met the national objective. This is a 2-part test. The units must be complete and they must have met the national objective. So you might be wondering, what if I funded a bunch of activities with solely program income? I didn't use any of my line of credit funds. Well, if you funded them solely with program income, you do not need to complete them or meet the national objective prior to the grant closeout. Now, you will eventually have to meet those criteria, but if you have some lingering activities funded 100% with program income and you want to close out, you can do that as long as you've met the initial criteria of any activities funded with your line of credit funds meeting the criteria of being completed and meeting the national objective. So if it's just funded with program income, those can meet the criteria later. So that's closeout criteria number 1. The second thing that you'll have to check off your list before you can formally close out your grant is that you have to meet the 25% set-aside requirement. Now everybody's familiar with that requirement, and of course that applies to both line of credit funds and program income as under the general NSP requirements. However, with respect to closing out your grant, the criteria that HUD is looking at will be specifically the line of credit. So to close out the grant, grantees must expend an amount equal to 25% of their initial line of credit amount to house families at or below 50% AMI. So you're going to look at your initial line of credit amount, take 25% of that, and you will have had to expend either program income or line of credit funds to meet that requirement. Now, with respect to the remaining amount that you have to meet for program income that you've earned at the date of closeout, you're going to have an additional 3 years from the date of closeout to expend an amount equal to 25% of all program income earned at the date that you close out, and the date of closeout will be the date that the closeout agreement is signed with HUD. And again, you can combine both program income and line of credit funds to meet this amount. So that might be a little bit confusing, but let's walk through an example. So suppose the grantee had an original line of credit amount, their original grant was $2 million. The program income they've earned by the date of closeout was $100,000. So under the NSP requirements, their total 25% set-aside requirement at the date of closeout would be $500,000, that's 25% of $2 million, plus $25,000, that's 25% of $100,000, for a grand total of $525,000. As we said, for meeting the closeout criteria only, HUD is going to be looking at this $500,000 amount, and that's the amount you will have had to have expended towards your 25% set-aside requirement prior to closing out the grant. So for this particular grantee, suppose that so far they've expended $510,000 towards meeting that requirement. So as you can see, $510,000 is greater than $500,000, and so they are able to check this box in terms of saying that they met this criteria for closing out, but they still have some work to do after closeout. So within the 3 years following closeout, they're going to need to expend an additional $15,000 towards this set-aside requirement in order to reach their $525,000. Now, in the closeout guide and the appendices, there is an annotated worksheet that HUD has developed to help grantees figure out what this amount is going to look like. And this is just a little screenshot of the annotated appendix. So we're going to take that worksheet and walk through it with our example. So the first line is your original grant. This is where we're going to fill in information about the original grant. In column A, we put our total grant amount, that's $2 million. In column B, we put 25% of that, that's that $500,000. And this is the box that you're going to look at to figure out what do I need to have expended towards my 25% set-aside requirement in order to close out my grant. So that's the box that you're going to really focus on in terms of have I met the criteria. Row 2, this is where you're going to record your program income. As of the closeout date, this grantee earned $100,000. 25% of that is $25,000. Row 3 totals these lines. And then in row 4, this is where we're going to look at the amount that the grantee has already expended to meet their national on activities that met the national objective towards the 25% set aside. So as we said, this grantee has expended $510,000. And remember that this can be made up of either line of credit funds or program income. So this last row then is the amount that is left to be expended over the next 3 years after closeout to finish meeting your overall requirement. And again, you're going to be subtracting line 4 from line 3, and you're getting that $15,000. Now, a few things to keep in mind: choosing this 3-year option to meet the requirements for program income earned at the time of closeout does not change any requirements that apply to program income that you earn following closeout. So basically, the example we use in the guide is that just because you've gotten an extension on your homework assignment doesn't mean that you don't have to comply timely with your future homework assignments. And grantees may expend future program income earnings toward meeting the requirement for program income on hand at the time of closeout. So anything you earn after closeout, in our example, could be used to help fund that additional $15,000 that has to be spent towards the set aside. We already talked about the worksheet. It's a good tool if you want to fill that in and see where you are in the process. And grantees must continue to report on their program income received before and after closeout. That requirement will continue. So then when we move on to criteria number 3, I'm going to pass it over to Mary, and she's going to walk through the next 2 criteria.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. As Jennifer said, there are 4 criteria, and I'll cover the last 2. The first one is all costs have been incurred. And basically what this means is that if you have contracted for certain tasks, particularly in terms of rehab and construction, which is a contractual obligation, all these costs have to be incurred prior to closeout, even if you've not yet paid the contractors. But all of your line of credit dollars have to be used and put into contracts so that you can say the costs are incurred. Secondarily, if one of the things that you are still using is administrative money from your original administrative line, those costs that are incurred can also be put as being, in other words, counted against your obligations on the line of credit dollars, even if the staff is paid later, so that if you're only doing staff payments monthly, even though you're closing out on the 31st, you can incur all those costs all month long, or whatever your payment period is, until such time as you actually close out the grant. Secondarily, any costs that you have from contingent liabilities, and typically we're looking at contingent liabilities as being things like audit costs and those related admin costs, third-party claims that you have come up against during the operation of your NSP program, and also those related administrative costs and any outstanding attorney's fees. So what you can do, HUD is allowing you to draw down those funds and hold them in a separate account until you've resolved any claims or any issues that have occurred during the administration of your program. So once again, it will give you the ability to pull down some of those dollars and make sure that they've been expended. So line of credit funds, we want to be aware of these 2 points too as well. Line of credit funds that had been previously reserved for administration cannot be spent for administration once you've closed out the grant. So if you have X amount of dollars left in your line of credit funds for admin, you need to get those costs incurred prior to closing out, or they will be lost to you. The other item that you need to be aware of as you're working towards your closeout is that land bank maintenance and stewardship cannot be drawn prior to closeout. What HUD is suggesting is that you use things such as program income to cover those costs. So you'll not be able to draw down those dollars prior to closeout, bank them and say, oh, they're for the operations of our ongoing land bank. So we want you to be aware of those 2 points. One, you have to spend your administrative money prior, and secondarily on the land banks, that if you have program income, think about using that for the ongoing maintenance of your land bank. So last but not least, the closeout criteria number 4. Other federal regulatory requirements are met. So what do we mean by that? As all of you who are NSP2 grantees and NSP3 grantees, there are other requirements that you were required to meet to utilize those grants. We're going to cover these requirements much more extensively next Thursday in the May 1st webinar. But we wanted you to be aware of what they are. The NSP2 unit performance measure, as you all know, you told HUD how many units you would be building, rehabbing, demolishing, whatever your unit measure was, whether or not you can meet that prior to closeout. And for the NSP2 grantees, whether you have worked in the target areas that you defined in your application. Both NSP2 and NSP3 grantees, whether or not you've met the demolition restrictions, and lastly, the green and energy efficiency requirements, whether or not you've met those as well. So, NSP2 action in target areas. You need to show, if you're an NSP2 grantee, that you have worked in the census tract that you targeted in your application. And if you've not already amended your application because there were potentially census tracts and target areas that you could not work in, then you need to discuss with HUD and take a look at whether or not it's necessary to amend your NSP2 action plan to make sure that you've actually met the requirements on the areas that you've targeted. And HUD did put out a policy alert at the beginning of this month that would give you more information, but as I said, we'll also cover that in much greater detail next week. And that is the end of the closeout criteria. So let me stop here and see if there are questions on just these 4 closeout criteria, if anybody has any specifics.
So thanks, Mary. Before we start with the questions from folks that might be on the line, we have a couple of questions that have come in through chat and the Q&A. So just to go in order of criteria, there's a question related to closeout criteria number 1, and it's pretty specific, so I'll try and read it reasonably slowly. And the question is, what if the line of credit funds were used to pay for an asbestos survey in furtherance of demolition of a blighted property, but something prevents the demolition itself? Perhaps the property owner files an administrative appeal, causing delay or abandonment of the demolition project. Does that asbestos survey cost need to be moved to a non-NSP funding source because the project, which was demolition of the blighted property, has not been completed?
No. The home program might make you do that, but in NSP we have allowed some of these failed soft costs that were paid for failed projects because, if you're doing an environmental review or an asbestos review or a lead assessment or something like that and you find a problem, then you shouldn't proceed. And we didn't feel like it was appropriate to penalize you for that. So we, as long as these are, not, voluminous, we have allowed grantees to spread those costs over the other activities or the other projects in that activity. So if it's in demolition and you have 10 demolitions that are in there, you can add the $10,000 or $2,000 or whatever, and just treat that as part of the entirety of the demolitions, and that something like that would be an activity delivery cost, so it would be part of the line item rather than part of the general administrative funds. So that's how you would, and those costs go. Other costs like that, staffing and so forth, also go in those line items. So that should take care of it. You should put it in the line item. Probably, you might want to have a little explanation someplace, in your file that just what happened here. But we expect those things to happen, and as long as you're not doing it every other time, you should be fine.
Right. We have a couple of questions related to criteria number 2, which is about the LH25 set-aside. The first one says, if the actual low-income spending exceeds the required amount prior to closeout, can the excess low-income expenditures be credited towards future low-income requirements on program income earned after closeout?
Well, there's sort of a couple different buckets of program income. You have obviously the amount, the 25% of your line of credit, which you need to do beforehand, and then you have that 3-year window to do all the program income you had on hand prior to closing out. And so any 25% set aside you have before you close out counts towards that 3-year window. But any program income earned after you close out your grant, you have to start over from scratch. So day 1 of post-closeout, you have started your 25% set aside over.
Do you want to repeat that?
So day 1 of post-closeout, you start from scratch. You start from 0 for any program earned after closeout.
So you'd have to do 25%. Well, based on the post-closeout rules too, because you don't have to meet the 25% set aside unless you have more than $250,000 worth of program income. So, you know, our attorneys felt like, you know, sort of mixing up these two pots of money was just going to get too complicated, and so they have said we really can't you can't get credit for any overproduction prior to closeout. I mean, we appreciate you doing that, and we don't want you to feel like we don't appreciate it, but for the purposes of closeout, we had to draw that line.
You've got some questions stacking up here, so I'm going to take one more written and then check with Adrian and see if we have any folks on the line wanting to ask questions verbally. And this one relates to criteria number 2 again. What date and time is used for closeout date? Does HUD give us a closeout date for determining the calculation for the 25% set aside? Our program income is earned every month because we have mortgage payments.
The closeout date is the official date that the HUD representative, so typically the CPD director, signs the closeout agreement.
So when they're calculating their LH-25, I guess the question is, if I'm earning program income every month, how do I call a hard stop to that?
You wouldn't stop. You would, if you signed it in the middle of the month, and say you get your program income payments on the 30th, and you sign the agreement on the 15th, the program income payments that come in on the 30th would then be post-closeout payments.
So on the closeout agreement, you're just going to report what you have in hand.
On hand, right.
Okay. Adrian, are there any callers on the line waiting for questions?
There are no questions at this time.
Okay. Then we will go ahead with more written questions. We have a question related to revolving loans, and the question is, do activities funded through a revolving loan fund need to be complete and have met a national objective prior to closeout?
Well, revolving loan funds typically have program income in there, typically solely program income.
Yeah, they're not funded with line of credit funds.
So there would be no line of credit funds in that project, so though it would eventually need to meet a national objective, it does not need to meet a national objective before you close out the grant.
Okay. And we have a couple of other questions related to complete expenditures. So the next question is, what is your definition of incurring admin costs to expend prior to closeout?
Well, it's you know, when you incurring a cost is when you are required to make a payment. So if you know, if I work 8 hours today, the federal government is required to pay me for that. They won't pay me for another couple of weeks. But, you know, if you're counting expenditures and you want to know what's incurred, it's the date that in the case of an employee, their salary was required to be paid. In the case of contractors, it is when they invoice you. But I would say, you know, we were noticing this as we listened to the presentation earlier. You know, if you're still paying contractors, you probably aren't ready for closeout because you probably don't have all your units occupied. I mean, you know, that's so. anyway, so I think that, the staffing and so forth, in order to draw down your line of credit, I mean, that's going to be your big expenditure worry. Everything else, as we said, life goes on pretty much the same after closeout. So it's just that you need to spend your line of credit down as far as possible before you can close out. And so that'll be the place that you're worrying about incurring costs.
Great, thank you. So speaking of life after closeout, and also admin funds, so there's a great segue there. The question is, if we have expended our entire line of credit, may we use program income for admin costs after closeout?
Yes, as long as you have the ability to spend the admin funds, in the sense that you have the sort of the credit from your 10% of grant funds and 10% of program income left over to, the ability in that space to expend admin funds, then yes, you may continue to spend admin funds.
And we would expect that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's some pretty active levels of program income in some areas, and that's going to be pretty labor intensive even after closeout, I think.
Right. And there's a question related to a follow-up related to what date will be used on the closeout agreement, and I believe what you said earlier was that it will be the date that it's signed by the HUD official.
Yes, the closeout agreement is signed by the HUD official will be the date the grant is closed.
Okay. So it's not when they request closeout or what the back and forth. It's the date that it is going to be actually signed by the HUD official that has the ability to do that.
Yeah, and remember, it's the closeout agreement. It's not the letter starting the closeout process or anything else. So.
Yeah, I think these are kind of details that, even though this is a pretty detailed slide presentation, we can't get everything in there. So a lot of these questions are answered in the guidebook. So that you can look them up too.
And as part of the readiness check, the provider will go through with you and explain those details.
The
Yeah.
TA provider.
Yeah.
Covered under section 4 of today's agenda.
Yeah.
So we have one more question, then we'll move on to the next section. And it's related again to program income. The question is, the grantee has been spending program income, although there's still funds available in the line of credit. Once it's closed, does that mean the portion in the line of credit will not be available anymore after the PI is fully expended? And I'm pretty sure the answer to that is yes. So spend it down.
Yes, it is. Once we close, that line of credit will be shut down. So we will work with you to make sure that that we don't leave any more than pocket change in there. But there might be $100 or $1,000 in there, but we're not going to force you to close out either. There isn't any requirement to close. There's no deadline. So if you've still got $10,000 or $50,000 or even $5,000 in there that you could use for something, use it.
Okay. We have one more quick question that I'm just going to get in, and then I'm going to turn it back to Mary to talk about what you can do to prepare for closeout. And the question is, pre and post closeout, can you use program income from NSP1 on an NSP3 project and vice versa?
Typically, yes. We put out a little policy note on this about like January of last year, 2013, something like that. That deals with using administrative costs from one program for the other. But, in general, and program costs, and I think we've always kind of done that. I mean, a lot of projects in NSP1, a lot of places bought a lot of properties and then ended up realizing that the individual costs were higher than they anticipated. So when they got NSP2 or NSP3, they went in, and as long as it's in the same project, the same target area and so forth, it should be fine. And I think there's for the most part, there aren't target areas after closeout, right?
Yeah,
so,
for the most part. We'll be coming out with some future guidance on target areas post-closeout.
But there is something, there is a short policy alert from January or February of 2013 if you want to look it up. But for the most part, you can do that.
Great. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to you, Mary, to talk about the next section.
Okay. Thank you, Dion. This section really is intended to give you some ideas on things that you could be working on to get ready for closeout. As John said when the webinar started, they're about to open up the process as soon as they get clearance to do that. And while there are some known grantees who are probably just ready to go, this is really intended for the majority of grantees who are thinking, what are the things that I need to do so that when I decide that I am ready to close out, it's a smooth process, I've got all my paperwork ready. So we really just want to give you some helpful suggestions on what I can do to prepare for closeout. And essentially, look at your record. The thing that I think we have found in working with a number of grantees with technical assistance is if you've got spectacular record keeping, you're not going to have trouble here. But if you have weak records, if you don't have a good land inventory, that you didn't document your accomplishments, remember you can't close out until you can document that each and every unit is occupied. If you've made financial errors in DRGR, then you're going to have to go back and try and reconcile all of these items. You've got to have a strategy for your land bank, and you need to have your long-term affordability set with all of your grantees, all of your developers. You have to know how you can track that. That's going to be key in terms of the long term. So what do you do? First of all, you have to reconcile your current QPR in DRGR. If your QPRs are coming out without errors, you're in good shape. But if there is something, you need to go back now and start looking to see where those errors might be. Have you put your units in the wrong categories? Are you not filling in the accomplishments for your units? These are the things that you need to look at. Make sure that you've completed all your activities that were funded with your line of credit dollars, and that you've put in the subrecipient data that shows that you've met a national objective. Confirm that you did spend that 25% on the set-aside units. Make sure that you've done that math correctly. Obligate your land bank properties. Make sure that if you've got a plan for how they're going to be used in the long term, you've got that down in writing and it's ready to go. And then lastly, of course, we want you to go and look at your agreements with your partners. Make sure that you've got the affordability periods in there. Make sure that your grantees understand that you will be coming out to monitor these things and what those steps are. So now's a good time to take a look at all those requirements and agreements. So how do you reconcile your QPR? DRGR is a reporting system. So it didn't make the error. If there is an error in the system, somebody inputted the information incorrectly. So what you want to do is go back and look at all of those entries and make sure they are correct. You know, there is help out there. If there's something that you're seeing just doesn't add up, doesn't strike you as it looks right, you know your properties, so start doing it. We do know that it can take some time if you have to go back and look at data over time. So small corrections can be big corrections if your errors have continued over fields. Remember, this program, particularly NSP 1's been open for several years. So you could have a compounding error that has built up over time. So we are suggesting folks go in, start looking at all the fields, make sure that everything adds up, whether it's financially, numbers of units, numbers of subrecipients, and the subrecipient data. And if you need help, and Jennifer's going to talk a little bit more in the last section here about how you may potentially could get some TA, you know, go online, ask questions, but this is really going to be the time-consuming piece in getting ready for closeout. It's not that you've spent your money, it's that all your data is correct as well. And we do realize for some folks, this could actually take some time. So now is a good time to start looking at it. And in particular, that your projects are benefiting households at or below 50% of the area median income. You know, you may have projects in the system that you did not count towards your 25% set aside. Go back and look at the data for each and every one of these units. You may have more there in terms of meeting the 25% set aside than you think you do. So what else can you do? Correct or change those DRGR entries. You know, you may have to create or delete activities. Revise your vouchers, and I realize it's very time-consuming, but there is help to be able to do that. Edit the QPRs to make sure you have the right addresses, beneficiaries, and expenditure data. These are the things that are going to be looked at. As you all know, how do you correct errors? You go in, and in that current QPR, do prior period corrections. HUD's not going to open up your old QPRs, but you can add this data to the current. And that's what HUD is asking you to do, is go back and reconcile what you have from the past in the current QPR. So, double check your beneficiary information. And for each activity, even if you think you're correct, check it anyway. Ensure that all the expenditures and program income are reported. That is absolutely key. The narrative should be clear, concise, tell the story. You know, in a couple lines, you can blow us all away and say, I did X so many units in this neighborhood, I've transformed this neighborhood. In very concise language, tell us how good this was. And we definitely want you to, once again, verify addresses. So there are tools for making changes, reconciling things in DRGR. There are the MicroStrategy reports, prior period correction tools, and if you haven't used one and want some help, you know, go to Ask a Question, go to the TA block in the portal and ask for some help. There's a Maintain Addresses feature, batch uploads. And once again, one CPD, ask a question, and request for TA. Nobody's asking you to struggle alone with a lot of this, but there is all kinds of help out there to help you get that perfect QPR. And what can I do to prepare? Complete all of the activities funded with line of credit, confirm the national objectives are met. That's two very important things I just said. Look at the MicroStrategies reports. Review your activities. And once again, tune in next week. We'll talk more in detail about all of these items, because these are the things that you need to do to meet those 4 closeout criteria. And, you know, HUD's not giving you a deadline, so you've got the time to take a step back, make sure that everything is in the proper place, is the correct information, and you have an opportunity to change it before you call up HUD and say, oh, I'm ready to close out. Turns out you're not, and then you spend a lot of time trying to correct all these errors. Once again, confirm the 25% set aside is met. You may have to go through your internal records and make sure that they say the same thing that's in DRGR. As I said, you may have done additional units beyond the ones that you originally proposed as low mod units. You know, make sure that the families that are in each and every one of these properties may or may not meet this criteria. I'm working on creating a DRGR report that will help you track this, and that will give you an additional tool to make sure that you're getting this. Use the worksheets that are included in the guide, particularly the one for this. Make sure that you are close on the 25%. So, land banks. As you know, if you have significant properties that you purchased over time and have put into a land bank for future use, make sure that you've obligated these properties for use that will meet a national objective. You've got to have a plan that shows how you're going to obligate these properties, that they will be committed, and it will be within that 10-year post-closeout period. So once again, it's that important date when the local HUD office signs your closeout agreement. You have 10 years from that date. And once again, more information next week on land bank plans.
Mary, let me just jump in here, because I know that we've had some anxious questions from land banks about, what do you mean by obligate? And we mean, you have a general plan. This property is going to be housing. This property is going to be commercial. We're not looking for, we don't expect you to know if it's going to be a duplex or, that's going to be a record store or whatever. Just sort of general types of property. So that, you will need more information about these properties than you need to give us. So just, don't fret too much about that one.
So you're suggesting just mark them commercial, residential for those that are...
Yeah, I mean, if you have more information, that's great. But we're, you're not. I mean, we're looking for a strategy here, not necessarily you know, a detailed plan for every single property.
And we're going to be coming out with a lot more information about land banks in this land bank plan. So don't feel that this is all we're going to tell you.
Right.
There's more coming.
We've been working on a lot of land bank issues recently, and you know, it's one of those things that we haven't had to, you know, resolve these questions, you know, during the course of the program. But now that we're getting closer, we are, you know, fleshing that out. And in fact, I think you and I, you know, wrote some additional material just in the guidebook itself. So I just don't want people to get too nervous about it. I don't think it's going to be a prohibitively difficult requirement.
Okay. And just a little more information on the issue of reviewing your agreements with partners. Because one of the things you want to do is make sure that there are affordability periods in the agreements and that you have created and crafted and recorded all of those instruments that you may be using to enforce affordability. We do find sometimes that folks, you know, think, oh, I've got the agreement, but have not taken that extra step to record liens or whatever instruments that you're using. So go back and go through all your agreements. Make sure that all that documentation is done and is in place, because let's face it, if it's not, you're going to have a terrible time trying to enforce affordability as you go back to monitor your subrecipients and your grantees. So make sure that all of that is in place before you do the closeout process. So last thing, confirm the dates and terms, the legal descriptions of the properties. Make sure that each and every one of your agreements spells out the responsibilities of the parties. What are you supposed to do as the grantee? What are your subrecipients and developers supposed to be doing? How they're going to use program income. We assume that you've made those decisions, that it's in the agreements, and that both parties really understand that. The continuing affordability and how you will maintain that. And then just make sure that on other federal requirements, all those other lovely federal requirements that you're required to comply with, that you've done your reporting, that you've done property inspections, that all of this paperwork is in place and will continue to be in place as you maintain the properties through the affordability period. So, assuming that you go back to all of these items, when you go to HUD and say, I'm ready to close out, you will be ready to close out. So let me stop here, see if there's questions on this part before Jennifer talks about the closeout process.
Great. Thank you, Mary. And Adrian, I just wanted to check and see if we had any folks who had queued up to ask verbal questions.
Yes, we do have one question. It comes from the line of Sheila Cade.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Hi, Sheila.
Oh, hi. Okay, so my question is that we, CPLC, we're responsible for almost a couple thousand units meeting the national objective. And so since we've generated a lot of program income and they have gone to acquire these units, does that mean that those units that were purchased with PI will not really officially have to meet the national objective until after closeout?
Generally speaking, yes. If they're purchased totally with program income, then there is no requirement prior to closeout to have them meet a national objective. But you know, if you have, if some of them have, then you'll kind of get credit for that. But the rest you can take for, what is it, 3 years? No.
I mean, eventually they will need to meet a national objective.
Yeah, if it's program income from before the closeout, then you have 3 years to meet a national objective. No? Okay.
So what I hear you saying is that, sure, our action plan has said we're required to meet X amount of units, but we really don't have to meet those X amount of units until after closeout if we've paid for those properties with program income.
Okay, so that's a little different issue, which is, you know, how how close do you have to get to your projections? You know, that's a little bit different issue. I mean, you know, because so Sheila works for Chicago's Board of Council, which is an NSP2 grantee, and NSP2 was a competitive process, so the rules are a little different from that. So if you're sitting out there in the state of South Dakota and this sounds unusual to you, don't worry about it. But for NSP2 grantees, there were target area requirements, there were minimum performance standards, and a few things like that. And so, you know, so when we decide whether you can close out, it will be, you know, based on our assessment of how close you came to meeting your original goals, rather than saying, well, you know, you'll meet them eventually because you have this program income and down the line. Now, after the closeout, we really don't have any way to sort of, you know, track. I mean, we track it, but we won't have any kind of way to enforce it one way or the other. So
we'll go into more detail of this type of stuff in next week's webinar. So we can spend a fair amount of time talking about this today.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, but it's so much fun. So on to more fun. Adrian, before I move on to the written questions, is anybody else on the line?
There are no further questions.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions that are about the intermingling and interrelationships of NSP1 and NSP3. The first one says, are NSP1 and 3 funds treated separately? In other words, can we close out NSP3 but not NSP1 at this time?
Yeah, you cannot close out both grants with the same documents. You have to go through the process for each grant separately.
But the order doesn't matter.
Right, but the order doesn't matter.
Right, so whatever's ready first, which
right.
in a lot of cases will probably be the NSP3.
In a lot of cases, that may be the case.
Typically, grants are a lot smaller, yeah.
We have a little bit of a different type of question related to those relationships, and it says, if we have a project acquired with NSP3 and rehabbed with NSP1, do we record beneficiary data in both activities or just one?
Both.
Right, that's always been true. Yeah. So there is, and so your next question is, why won't that be result in double counting? And the answer is that we have a process to match those up to addresses so that we, you know, take out a duplication to the extent possible. So don't. Yeah. So it's okay. You have to report it in both programs, or otherwise you won't be able to close out.
So it will be set up, reported in both, and then on the back end it will be kind of deduped.
Deduped, right.
Perfect. And then we have one more written question at this point, and it says, just to verify there's no deadline for closeout, correct, which is correct. And then the second part of the question says, is there any penalty for not closing out after the final line of credit funds have been drawn, especially, for example, if land bank properties haven't been occupied by LMMI households yet? So even if they draw everything down, would they be penalized for not immediately closing out?
There's no penalty, except for that every 3 months you're going to have to do another QPR.
Which is really penalty enough.
Right, exactly. Or you could do a yearly QPR. It's your, or annual performance report.
Right.
It's your choice.
Well, let's just say there's currently no penalty.
Yeah.
Oh, another check.
Oh, I hear a caveat.
I can't envision that doing a QPR is not enough of a penalty to get you to want to close out.
Right. Yes, but if the entire upper Midwest is dragging its feet to stretch out the date on the 10-year requirement to dispose of land bank properties, you know, I think we'll get suspicious. But, you know, realistically, I mean, that would be the kind of the only big reason to do it, to drag it out, because you don't want that clock to start. I think that based on what Hunter said earlier and some of the conversations we've been having, you know, I think we're going to get that hurdle to be, you know, jumpable for the land banks, so that you don't have to be afraid of closing your grant out and starting the clock.
Got it. All right. I don't see any other questions at this time, so I think we can move on, Jennifer, with the closeout process and technical assistance section.
Okay, great. The closeout process, we covered this in pretty great detail on the February 25th webinar, so I'd encourage everybody to go back and take a listen to that if you haven't already heard it. But we're going to walk through the steps here just so folks who didn't get a chance to hear or who would like a reminder understand what it's going to look like. Once you've prepared yourself for closeout, you've met all the criteria, what happens next? So the first step in the closeout process is that the grantee and HUD will jointly determine that the grantee is ready following a readiness check with the TA provider. And the key here is that there should be constant and careful communication between the grantee and their HUD representative to decide that the grantee is actually ready for closeout. Part of that process we're going to talk about in a little bit is a readiness check, where a TA provider will work directly with the grantee and be in communication with HUD about whether the grantee has met the closeout criteria and is generally prepared to commence the formal process. So once it's determined that the grantee is ready, HUD will send a closeout package to the grantee. And in that package, you're going to receive a closeout checklist. You'll receive a closeout certification form of one that will have to be completed when you send back when you return your package to HUD, and some other materials. And if you look in the closeout guide, it lists out all the different pieces of the closeout package. Some of them are attached to the guide as appendices, and for instance, the closeout checklist is actually there as a blank form so that you can work with it, and then also in an annotated version to sort of help you understand what HUD's looking for on some of the more nuanced questions or the ones that might raise some questions for grantees. So take a look at those appendices. That'll help you understand what kind of material you're going to have to complete in order to submit your package to HUD. So once you do submit the package, HUD will take it and review it. That brings us to step 4. There may be some questions back and forth, clarifications that are needed. But once HUD is happy with the package that's been submitted, they will complete that closeout certification. Remember, the grantee will have already signed it when they sent in their package, and now HUD will complete that closeout certification and alert the grantee that the grantee now has 90 days to submit the final QPR. And 90 days might sound like a long time, but as Mary mentioned, small errors in the QPR often unravel into much more complex issues, sort of like going down a rabbit hole. So you want to start early on looking at your QPR to clean up any errors that you might have in there. And you should stay tuned for an upcoming webinar focused exclusively on the QPR, and also some new DRGR MicroStrategy reports that will help you through the closeout process, because we're going to kind of provide you with the functionality to understand where you are in terms of getting ready to meet the criteria. The next step in the process, once you've completed your final QPR, HUD will review the QPR and prepare the closeout agreement, and then HUD will execute that closeout agreement with the grantee. And remember that this date of this agreement is the date of your actual closeout. So all of these requirements that sort of date back to the date of closeout, for instance, program income, the management plan for continued affordability, things like that, land bank issues, all of those things that reference a closeout date is referring to this closeout agreement date.
Hey, Jennifer, just to back up real quick 1 second. Tuesday, May 20th is when we will be having that webinar on QPRs.
Okay, great. And this little orange box here on the side sort of points out to you at areas where it might be helpful to request some technical assistance. And we'll talk about what kinds of technical assistance are available in a minute. But just to know that these are areas that would probably be primed for technical assistance, but you can really request assistance at any time during the process that you might need some extra help. So keep in mind, closeout must be completed separately for each NSP grant, like Hunter was talking about earlier in reference to the question that we got. You have to complete this process for each grant. So each grant gets its own closeout package, and you'll have to walk through these steps for each grant. HUD will work directly with grantees on closeout, not individual subrecipients. So if you're a subrecipient, you should be following the guidance that you've received from the grantee, the primary grantee, and comply with your subrecipient agreement. And if you're a grantee that has subrecipient agreements, make sure you're looking at your agreement and communicating carefully with your subrecipients about what's going to be required. And then entitlement communities that are members of NSP2 consortia will need to complete some of these closeout forms. So just keep that in mind. It's a little bit of a different twist. Okay, technical assistance. So we've talked a bit about this readiness review that will be available to grantees prior to closeout. Again, people need to be working closely with their HUD reps at the beginning and throughout the closeout process. And prior to receiving the package, the grantee will need to submit a technical assistance request through the OneCPD portal requesting a readiness review. What the readiness review will do, a TA provider will be assigned to the grantee, and as part of that process, the TA provider will contact the grantee's field office and make sure everybody's on the same page with where the grantee is and the kinds of things that need to be reviewed and to ensure that the grantee is ready to close. During this readiness check, the TA providers will work with grantees to identify whether the criteria has been met. So we'll go through those 4 closeout criteria and make sure we can check the box for each one, walk through the closeout checklist, make sure that everything on the closeout checklist is in good order and ready to go. And if that's the case and there are no other outstanding issues that have been identified in the readiness review, then the grantee would be recommended to commence the formal closeout process. Now, depending on the needs of the grantee that come up during this readiness review, some additional on-call technical assistance may be provided. But like I said, as needed technical assistance is always available if you ask for it. You may need assistance for a whole range of things related to this process because it is very detailed. You might need help understanding the closeout criteria. You might need help preparing the closeout documentation. As I mentioned, in your closeout package you'll have a bunch of materials, and you can look at those as appendices to the closeout guide. So you may need some help preparing those documents. You may ask for a review of the documentation. Perhaps you felt comfortable completing them, but you'd just like someone to take a second look. You can discuss record keeping needed to substantiate information provided in the closeout package. Mary talked about making sure that you have strong records. So if you have any questions about what's required, technical assistance is available to help answer those questions. And then a very big one that most people will probably be seeking technical assistance for is reconciling the data and information in DRGR. So in order to submit a request for technical assistance, and this is when you're about to undergo the readiness review, or if you just need technical assistance generally, you're going to go to the website here, onecpd.info/technical-assistance/, and you're going to click on Request Technical Assistance. At that point, you're going to be prompted to log in, and once you're logged in, you'll complete some information about the organization, the kind of technical assistance that you need, and just generally why you're requesting the assistance. This is a screenshot of what that looks like. Once you're logged in, you'll see this screen. You'll see here at the top portion of the screen, you're going to click NSP because that's the area, topic area where you'd like the assistance. And then here at the bottom, it walks you through these 6 items that you need to complete information so that the technical assistance request can be routed and assigned properly. The questions can be asked in 2 ways following this part of the webinar. And I think that brings us to our last slide. But I did want to mention that there is the on-call technical assistance that you can request, but there's also the Ask a Question. And you can go in and submit a question either to the general NSP pool if you have more policy type questions that are fairly simple to ask and you would like a quick turnaround, or if you have DRGR specific questions, there is a specific DRGR Ask a Question pool. So I think that with that, we can check to see if we have any additional questions that have been submitted on this section.
Great. Adrienne, do we have anyone online?
Not at this time.
So we have a couple of questions that were slight holdovers from the last section. The first question is, if we used state NSP funds to acquire a single-family property and entitlement NSP funds to renovate the property, do both jurisdictions report the national objective and address?
Yes.
And then is there still an assumption that that would be deduped, or is that not as much of an issue?
Grantees shouldn't worry about us duplicating or whatever we call it. Records. We'll handle that. But if you spend money on a property, you need to report it, because how else do we know that you've properly spent the funds?
Right. You got to report the accomplishment, and the only way to do that is in two different places. So I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this, religion on deduplication. I mean, obviously it's needed, but being deduped has this kind of a weird,
Well, but it's a level of caring, so you can appreciate that.
Well, I guess the other point I would make is that every project, or I guess it's common for projects to use multiple sources of funding to get completed. So it's expected that you're going to have to report on a project in multiple places, particularly when they're high value projects.
That's a really good way to look at it. Like, if you use CDBG funds or use some sort of federal or some sort of charitable trust funds, you're still going to report on the property. So it doesn't matter if it's 1 or 2, or it's state 1 and local 2, or whatever it is. You still need to report on the property for each grant.
Yeah, and in some cases it's more than that,
Yeah.
Okay. We have another question. It says, I'm still learning, which I think applies to all of us. When we're talking about line of credit funds expended and objective met for closeout, we are talking about total grant funds, right, and not each subrecipient's grant fund. So if I have subrecipients, I can't close them out individually. We're talking about one process for the entire grant.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you may have some internal closeout process, which is fine, but closing out with HUD, you can only close out the grant as an entire grant.
But I mean, that can work to your advantage, because if you've got one subrecipient that's overproduced and you've spent all your line of credit funds and you've met all your national objectives, then the fact that the other one is a little bit farther behind may not slow you down.
And so we're moving on to more process and timing questions now. And the question is, so the certification executed by HUD must be received prior to submitting the final QPR.
No.
Right.
It does not need to be submitted. You could submit the final QPR pretty much any time after you get the packet, or even before that. I mean, once you're done and you're not doing any more, you can submit your final QPR whenever you want. Now, as you go through the closeout process, you might find that you need to open it up and redo it. But so I wouldn't recommend doing it too soon. But you can submit the QPR at any point during the process, the final QPR.
Right. But it says under the, just to be clear, on slide 44, it says HUD executes closeout certification, and then once that is done, the grantee has 90 days to submit the final QPR.
Right. Yeah, and that is the case. I mean, you do have that full 90 days, which you can take if you want, but you do not need to.
Okay, perfect. And speaking of process, here's I can't wait to hear the answer to this. How long is the process estimated to take?
90 days. No, that will be in about 90 to 180 days. We're probably going to answer that question fairly.
Well, we actually
still working it out.
We have several grantees that have valiantly volunteered to be the first ones through the process, and we'll see, because we want to make sure it's working smoothly too. But yeah, I think it's going to take in that time range. It depends on, it really depends on how good your records are, as I think Jennifer and Mary said. early on. You know, if your records really are in good shape and they, you know, add up and they add up and down and sideways and you've got everything done, it shouldn't take all that long, maybe a month or two, but it's probably like the minimum, but
yeah.
It could drag out, I'm sure.
Right.
You need a 10-year limit for that too, right?
So not to nag on this question of duplicates, but there is a question, a slightly different take, and it says, we purchased a home, rehabbed it, and sold it to an income-qualified buyer. Later, we reacquired the same property and resold it to a different qualified buyer, which creates duplicate addresses. Will this be a problem in the QPR?
It shouldn't be.
Well,
I guess the problem is the affordability area.
You know what? That is that question raises some other questions. I would recommend you submit and ask a question asking that very question, because there may be some other things that we need to talk about with that, such a scenario.
Yeah, it just so happens I had a call from someone who's got this sort of related problem like that with somebody leaving the unit and trying to get somebody else in it. So, yeah, we haven't had too many of those, so let us look that up. But, you know, when you send that question in, and you don't have to make it any longer than what you said here, but just put direct to HUD on that, because then the people that work on those will send it to us, and you know, we can get it done pretty quickly.
Okay. Great. So that can be submitted through the Ask a Question through the One CPD portal.
Right.
Well, here's an interesting take on the QPR. So is there still a QPR due by April 30th for the period of January 1 to March 31st if we intend to close out the grants? Or can we wait till the closeout process starts?
You know when the grant's going to close out.
You still need to submit your QPR for this quarter. No one can wait until later.
It will be due until your grant is closed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
it was a really good try, though.
Yeah. Yeah. And you never know if you're going to be confronted with any delays or how long the process is going to take. So you should just continue carrying out your program with business as usual until you have that closeout agreement signed.
Although Hunter does feel that having quarterly reports instead of annual ones is probably the most significant pressure you will have, the least comfortable thing that you will want to keep doing. But until you close, they will be due quarterly.
And whoever asked that question probably agrees with me.
Great. Adrian, do we have anyone queued up for questions on the line?
And there are no questions in the queue.
Okay. I'm sorry, was there or was there not?
No.
There were not.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of more in the Q&A written. So somebody's been perusing the closeout guide. In the closeout guide, it talks about compiling an inventory of any real property and equipment purchased. Does equipment include computers, printers, copiers, etc.?
Yes. Over, what is 20?
There's a dollar value. I think it's $5,000.
Yeah. Right. It's $5,000 per single piece of equipment.
Yeah, that's a CDBG requirement that's just passing through here. So, right. But yes, you do, and that's a completely different set of questions than your continued affordability.
Right, and I would recommend that those folks look at the actual requirement, because usually the equipment value is a pretty high threshold, and it's per piece of equipment, not total. So if you're just buying kind of standard office stuff, it can be pretty hard to actually hit that threshold. Right. So that would be something that they would really want to look at further. We have a question from a state related to program income, and it says, as a state grantee with local entitlement sub-grantees, we receive program income from our subs. Can we close out NSP 1 and NSP 3 and allow them to maintain program income without submitting to the state again after closeout?
No, unfortunately. The two things that are different for states in the NSP program than in the CDBG program. First is that, yes, you must continue to report on any program income that your subrecipients, whether they be an entitlement community or not, generate. And two, the threshold for what's considered program income is $25,000, not the $35,000 as it is in the state CDBG program.
There was, earlier on, there was a lot of back and forth on how we were going to deal with this issue from a policy standpoint, and the final ruling was that we wanted to the funds, the program income, to continue to be used in areas of greatest need and for NSP eligible activities. So by the state receiving this money back, then they can make sure that it's going to those greatest need areas.
Okay. And we have another question related to line of credit and program income. And here we go. This is more of a strategic question, I think. If we have a lot of program income and line of credit admin money, how do we spend the line of credit admin dollars, and do we need to spend it down to, say, under $100,000 to close out?
That question seems to have, like I think you were just saying, there's
a couple pieces.
Yeah, a couple misunderstandings there. And you know what? I'm almost inclined to say let's talk about this next week, because I think we're getting quite a few of these, and I don't want to...
But let's just clarify.
You mean on the May 1st webinar?
Yeah, and because, I mean, if you want to do
Well, I was just going to clarify on one level that you may have originally designated an amount of money as program admin, but you know you're entitled to spend 10% of your grant plus program income, and if you don't have to spend it 10% for every dollar, and so if you've got hardware projects that you could spend the line of credit funds on, and you save your program income for admin, you're allowed to do that kind of thing.
You could close out your grant and not spend $1 of admin, and then you have that 10% capacity for admin in the future.
Right.
So if you have $1 million grant, you have $100,000 worth of admin, you could close out and never spend $1 of that, just let's pretend you don't get any program income. You close out your grant, you've somehow magically get program income after you've closed out your grant. I don't know how that would work, but you have up to $100,000 of that program income you get after you close out that you could use for admin.
All right. This is one place you can kind of bank it.
So. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say is in terms of how much money can be left in your line of credit, that's really up to you, because any money that you leave in your line of credit when you close out will be forfeited. So I think as you read the question, Dion, you said something like $100,000. That sounds like a significant amount of money. So you'd probably want to use up as much of that as possible based on your level of need before you want to close out and turn off that faucet.
Right, but it's your call, as David says. So I mean, if that makes sense to you, then it's your call.
Right, and there's a follow-up question here that I think is basically confirming what you guys were just saying about can unspent admin funds be reallocated to other line items?
Right.
And, as you mentioned before, the answer is yes, because that was really always meant to be a maximum, similar to the CDBG and other programs where that's kind of the maximum you can spend, but you can always spend it on program activities if you don't need it.
Yeah, it's a budget. It's a percentage, so you don't have to you don't have to hold the original amount for the original grant or anything like that. You have some flexibility, shifting funds around between approved items as long as you're not going over the limits.
So we are tapped out on the written questions. Adrian, do we have anybody in queue?
Not at this time.
David and John and Hunter, or Mary and Jennifer, are there other comments that you want to add? We're running ahead of schedule, which is lovely.
Just to go back to the admin thing, we'll definitely have some slides in the next webinar, just sort of working showing what we're talking about here, about the capacity and pre and post closeout, because this is sort of a confusing topic that, you know, we can always explain again.
Yeah, and it's been a concern from the very beginning of, you know, how do you monitor continued affordability? I mean, I don't think there's going to be, you know, a huge amount of work, but there will be some work. And so if there is a way for you to kind of push some of your budget back into the post-closeout period, you know, or, you know, use program income, you know, use most of your program income for admin, you know, having used most of your grant funds and pre-closeout program income for hard costs, you know, there's some flexibility there. You know, it would make some sense to push this back. Or similarly with land banks, how do you keep paying for land banks? There's labor involved in that, and hopefully you get some income, but you might not. So you may be able to shift some funds from other projects, from other program income on other projects into the land banks.
One other comment I'll make is that, you know, we've been talking about closeout from a general perspective for the most part, because, you know, we as HUD, we've been working on this notice, we've been working on the guide, and we're sort of thinking about it at a macro level. But when it comes down to it, for each and every one of you as a grantee, it really is an individual experience that you're going to go through. Which is why we've set up this readiness check, and we're going to work with you one-on-one to make sure that all your ducks are in order, and that you're maximizing the program to the extent possible. So hopefully it'll be a positive experience.
Yeah, a lot of that's going to be done by your field officers who are closer to you, so that, you know, they know other things, you know, your whole program. So that's true, though. It will have to be customized.
So there.
It looks like another question came in.
Too late. Too late.
Yeah.
Oh, come on. It's only fair. It's from somebody who started us off, so it's a follow-up. And you may want to defer this, but it says if the only use of program income after closeout was for admin expenses for ongoing program admin, long-term income compliance, how would we meet the 25% low-income expenditure requirement using only admin?
Well, I would assume, the example I used, I said 100,000, so you would fall underneath the 250,000 threshold
per
year for the 25% set aside. So that is how, in that example that I used, that would work. If you earned over $250,000 per year, then yes, you couldn't just use all of your, if you had the capacity for $250,000 for the program, for admin, you would also have to spend some of those funds on meeting the 25% set aside.
But regardless of how much program admin you have in hand, as long as it's not a de minimis amount, then you're going to have to carry out some activities with it, be it the set aside or others. You can't just do program admin.
You have the capacity.
You have the what?
Capacity.
10%.
Well, it's going to depend on your source of funds, and you know, realistically, you're not going to. I mean, I don't think most people are going to have a huge carryover in terms of capacity. I mean, it's not going to be like all your admin money. So, you know, you're most likely you're going to be doing projects, but you may be able to do, you know, 20% of your money might be able to go to admin, or even 30%. You know, if you have that original sort of budget capacity. So, but I think most grantees with a 10% admin cap aren't carrying large amounts of capacity into closeout. But that could be one thing you might want to check, though, because I think a lot of people, you know, we've been through this in the entitlement program recently with, and we had a policy out on activity delivery costs versus program administrative costs came out a couple of years ago that the VEB worked on, and you know, a lot of these costs for your programs are activity delivery costs, which can go into the project line item rather than come out of your 10% general administrative cap. So you might want to look at, you know, the people that are actually, you know, do an intake for your rehab loans, or the inspectors who are checking the rehab, or any of the people who are on the front lines of this program. Typically, their time is project time. It's counted as activity delivery, and it could eligibly be charged to the project line item rather than general admin. But if you're looking for ways to carry some balance forward, that, I mean, I don't know how complicated that would be for you, but it might be worth checking out.
Any other questions?
Just one more. From a state, we anticipate a subrecipient generating PI after closeout. Will we be required to report quarterly or annually?
After closeout, all grantees will report annually. So, annually for the situation.
Right.
Everybody's annual. And what we'll do is we will sort of line up your CDBG reporting and your NSP reporting, so it's, you only have, you know.
You're in the con plan cycle.
Yeah, exactly. So you may end up with your first year being 6 months, 7 months, and then in the future you don't have 2 random reporting dates. You just have 1 reporting date.
Well, yeah, and it allows you to program your funds more
yeah.
Intelligently too.
Adrian, do we have anybody on the line for a question?
There are no questions from the phone lines.
So people just aren't calling in anymore.
They're not. They want the answer, the question in writing, and the answer in transcript, I guess.
I want to thank Sheila from CPLC for calling in. We should give her a special call, shout out for being our one.
It's always the NSP2 grantees, you know.
CPLC is a very bold organization, so we're not surprised. But yeah, it's just kind of odd, you know. It sort of takes out that human touch. I don't know.
Maybe we'll, next time what we'll do is, if you want to get on the line, we'll take your questions first.
All right, there you go. We need incentives here.
Okay, a little incentive. I can't, get them off QPR status, but I can put them at the front of the line.
Well, I think what you have to promise them is if they ask their question verbally, they're going to get the answer that they want.
I am not making that promise.
2,000 people on the line.
Great. So if anybody, if there's nothing else to wrap up, I do just want to remind folks about the upcoming webinars, and also that they always have the ability to submit their questions through Ask a Question outside of the webinar process.
Yeah, there is a land bank webinar scheduled at this point for the 13th of May, I think. So, and that's going to be kind of an open, semi-open. I mean, there'll be some presentations. Michelle Wildman from Michigan, I think, is going to run it, and we're getting some other people. But we want to set it up in a way that people will just ask a lot of land bank-related questions, so we figure out what other policies we have to write. But then, yeah, I think the one next week on the 1st, May Day. Maybe we'll have our PRA liberated by that time, too.
If not, it will be within the next few days, I think.
So, yes.
And we also have when is the QPR webinar scheduled for?
20th.
May 20th.
May 20th.
Right.
So a couple of dates for folks to hold. And then we do have one question that just came in from somebody who actually doesn't have any PI coming back on their NSP1 activities. And their question is, once they've closed out and their closeout's been accepted, will they still have to do an annual report?
Yes.
Just for the continued
affordability. Yeah.
Continued affordability, yeah, but I don't think if you don't have any, really do not have activities, then there's nothing to report
right.
there.
I mean, it's just basically going to say that, the continued affordability still remains.
Right.
So it's more like an annual certification.
A status update on your inventory.
Be pretty minimal, though. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, I hate to close it up 21 minutes early, but we don't have anything else.
Well, let's close out the closeout webinar.
Let's close it out.
And I need to get a readiness check first. Better call Dion. Okay, yeah,
Great.
come back next week, everybody, and we'll kind of dig down another layer here. Thank you all.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon and a great rest of your week.
This concludes today's conference. You may now disconnect.